Okay, picture Europe before 1517. Imagine a world where every street, every town, and every conversation is somehow connected to the church. Life is slow, predictable, and honestly, a little bit dull, unless you're really into incense and Gregorian chants. It's like a giant monastery, but not just for the monks, everyone's in on it. The rhythm of daily life is set by the ringing of church bells, the chanting of prayers, and the endless cycle of religious festivals. The Catholic Church is the biggest game in town, actually the only game in town. If you wanted to get ahead, make friends, or just stay out of trouble, you played by their rules. They're calling the shots on everything: politics, money, education, even what you could eat on Fridays. The church was the ultimate authority and everyone knew it. It's like they invented too big to fail. Their influence was everywhere, from the grandest cathedral to the tiniest village chapel. Imagine life revolving around church rituals, Latin prayers you barely understand, and constant guilt trips about sinning. Most people couldn't even read the Bible themselves. It was all filtered through the priests. Seriously, people were stressed about going to hell for like everything. Even the smallest slip-up could mean years in purgatory. Then there were indulgences, get-out-of-jail-free cards for sin. The church said you could buy your way to forgiveness, and people lined up for the chance. Need to build a new cathedral? Sell some indulgences. The bigger the project, the more forgiveness you could buy. Want to ensure your great-aunt Agnes gets a comfy spot in purgatory? Indulgences to the rescue. It was spiritual insurance, medieval style. It was basically a spiritual ATM for the church. The more you paid, the better your odds. At least that's what people were told. Not cool, right? People were starting to question things. Whispers of doubt began to spread, even if most folks kept quiet. But criticizing the church? That was like arguing with your grandma about her fruitcake. You just didn't do it. The risks were real, and the consequences could be harsh. But then came this dude, Martin Luther, and everything changed. Suddenly the Snoozefest was over, and Europe was about to wake up. Now, Martin Luther wasn't your typical party animal. He was a monk, a scholar, and let's be real, a bit of a worrywart. Imagine a German dude with a serious case of Catholic guilt. That was Luther. Luther was bothered by the church's shenanigans, especially the whole indulgence racket. He believed salvation wasn't something you could buy, it was a free gift from God. He was all about faith over fancy rituals. So, Luther did what any good, frustrated academic would do. He wrote a strongly worded letter to the Pope. But this wasn't just any letter, it was like the ultimate subtweet heard round the world. It was time for the church to get schooled, and Luther was just the teacher for the job. In 1517, Luther nailed his now famous 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, Germany. Back then, it was like the town bulletin board, the Facebook wall, the Twitter feed all rolled into one. Think of the 95 Theses as 95 tweets about what was wrong with the church. Luther's main beef? He believed salvation came through faith alone, not by buying indulgences or doing good deeds just to impress God. He also thought the Bible should be accessible to everyone, not just the clergy who could read Latin. Luther's ideas were basically theological dynamite. People were like, wait, you mean I don't have to pay my way into heaven? And I can actually read the Bible myself? Sign me up. The printing press, the social media of its day, was a true game changer for Europe. Before its invention, ideas traveled slowly, passed from person to person, often distorted along the way. But suddenly, with the clatter of metal type and the smell of fresh ink, information could be copied and shared at a speed that was revolutionary for the time. The press helped spread Luther's ideas like wildfire. Pamphlets and translations of the Bible were flying off the presses faster than you could say indulgence. For the first time, ordinary people could get their hands on texts that had once been locked away in Latin, reserved for the elite. It was the Renaissance equivalent of going viral. News, arguments, and radical new thoughts were suddenly accessible to anyone who could read, or even just listen to someone reading aloud in the town square. People were debating Luther's ideas in taverns, universities, and even gasped their own homes. The Reformation became a topic of conversation everywhere, from bustling city streets to quiet rural cottages. It was the Reformation, and it was shaking things up. The old order was being challenged, and the energy of change was in the air. The Catholic Church, used to having the only microphone, wasn't happy. For centuries, it had controlled what people heard and believed. They tried to silence Luther, but it was too late. The message was out, and it was spreading faster than they could contain. He had already hit send on his tweets, and the people were retweeting. The more the church tried to clamp down, the more people wanted to read what Luther had to say. The Reformation wasn't just about theology, it was about power. Who got to decide what was true? Who had the right to speak, and who had to listen? People were tired of the church's control over their lives. They were frustrated by corruption, high taxes, and rules that seemed to benefit only the powerful. They were ready for a change, and Luther gave them the words and the courage to demand it. The printing press didn't just spread information, it sparked a revolution that would change Europe forever. The Reformation wasn't a one-man show. Think of it as a theological boy band with Luther as the lead singer. You had John Calvin, the French theologian who believed in predestination. God's already decided who's going to heaven, and there's nothing you can do about it. Talk about taking the pressure off. And then there was Henry VIII, the King of England, who was more interested in getting a divorce than debating theology. But when the Pope wouldn't grant him an annulment, Henry was like, fine, I'll start my own church. And thus, the Church of England was born. Talk about a power move. These guys, along with many others, created different branches of Protestantism. It was like the Reformation went to a music festival and came back with a whole new playlist. So, what did Protestants actually believe? Well, they were big on the Bible as the ultimate authority. They believed in salvation through faith alone, not by good works or indulgences. They emphasized the priesthood of all believers, meaning you didn't need a priest to interpret the Bible for you. Protestantism was all about personal responsibility and a direct relationship with God. No more middlemen, no more guilt trips, just you and your conscience. Oh, and maybe a really big Bible. These new ideas were revolutionary. They empowered individuals, challenged authority, and paved the way for a more democratic society. The Reformation wasn't all theological debates and Bible studies. It was a time of intense drama, high stakes, and larger-than-life personalities. The world was changing fast, and people were forced to pick sides, sometimes with everything on the line. There were some epic showdowns, too. These weren't just polite disagreements, they were battles of words, ideas, and sometimes even swords. Take the Diet of Worms in 1521, for example. Martin Luther, a simple monk, was put on trial for heresy in front of the most powerful leaders in Europe. The whole continent was watching to see what would happen. He stood up to the Holy Roman Emperor himself, refusing to back down or recant his beliefs, even though he knew his life was at risk. It was the ultimate mic drop moment. Luther famously declared, "Here I stand, I can do no other. God help me, amen." That act of defiance sent shockwaves across Europe. But the Reformation wasn't just about church leaders. Ordinary people got swept up in the chaos too. The Peasants' War broke out when German peasants, inspired by Luther's message of spiritual equality, decided to fight for social and economic justice against their feudal lords. Sadly, it didn't end well for the peasants. Their rebellion was brutally crushed, leaving thousands dead and hopes for change dashed. Luther himself was horrified by the violence and ended up siding with the princes, urging them to restore order, even if it meant bloodshed. And across the Channel, things were just as wild. Enter King Henry VIII, famous for his 6 wives and even more famous for his break with the Catholic Church. Henry wanted a divorce the Pope wouldn't grant, so he took matters into his own hands. He broke from Rome, declared himself head of the Church of England, and cycled through wives like they were fashion accessories. The result? A messy, dramatic, and unforgettable chapter in history, full of power struggles, betrayals, and enough scandal to fill a dozen history books. The Reformation had a lasting impact on the world. It led to religious freedom, the rise of nation-states, and a greater emphasis on education and literacy. It also sparked centuries of religious wars and persecution. Today, the Reformation's legacy lives on in our values of individual liberty, freedom of conscience, and the separation of church and state. It reminds us that questioning authority and fighting for what we believe in is never a bad thing. So, next time you're scrolling through Twitter, arguing about politics, or reading a book in your own language, remember the Reformation. It was a time of upheaval, change, and ultimately, progress. And who knows, maybe you're even a little bit Protestant yourself.